6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So hello everyone, welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast, and today we welcome back author, historian, friend, Damien Lewis. How you doing, Damien?
Yeah, very good. Good to be with you again.
So I'm really glad to have you back on to talk about your newest book, SAS Great Escapes Four, gripping escape stories from World War II World War II heroes. But I wanted to ask you, this is now your fourth Great Escape book. What makes you want to continue writing these stories?
Well, apart from the fact that books have been very successful, it's always good to have a, kind of long-running brand of that nature. There's something about small units of men deployed deep behind enemy lines on missions of, unbelievable daring, where the chances of death, capture or injury are extremely high, that makes them naturally the subject of these kind of great escape stories, because obviously capture leads to escape, or the attempt to capture and the hunt leads to escape. So time and time again one comes across these kind of stories when researching the operations of these kind of units in World War II in particular. So yeah, I would argue that there's no other unit that, other than the SAS or related special forces, Long Range Desert Group, SOE, other agents of that nature, who would be more akin to naturally getting involved in capture and escape as those guys and women were.
It's always really interesting and inspiring reading some of their stories as well, because there's the Germans and the commando order, the reaction to some of these missions is haunting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, obviously, by the time many of these individuals went into the field, we didn't have a copy of the commando order, but we didn't get one until autumn 44. But we certainly knew that something of that nature existed. Hitler's commando order, as it became known, decreed that any of these kind of operators, any special operators caught, behind the lines, whether in uniform, out of uniform, or fighting or trying to surrender, would only be kept alive for long enough for the Gestapo and SS to question or torture them, and then they would be murdered, obviously. Yeah, that illegal order, because obviously these men and women were deploying behind the lines as bona fide combatants of a bona fide nation in uniform, mostly, obviously not always with SOE, but with SAS operations in uniform, and therefore should by the rules of war have been awarded all the protections of the Geneva Convention, but of course, invariably they weren't. So you had these people going into these kind of missions knowing that capture could lead to death and worse than death, horrendous torture and everything that went with it. But they went anyway. So yes, you're right. The stories are incredibly uplifting, more so than they might have been, knowing that was the kind of hell they were potentially heading into.
One story, the one that I want to focus on today, Jack Alcock and Operation Pistol. It was really interesting seeing those dynamics play out on their landing and in their mission. But who was Jack and what was Operation Pistol?
Jack Alcock was a long-standing member of 2 SAS, the 2nd SAS regiment. Why was there 2 SAS as well as 1 SAS? Well, after David Stirling, the SS founder's capture in February 1943 in North Africa, engaged on a mission deep in the desert, got captured by the enemy. In fact, captured by a unit that General Rommel had founded to track down and hunt down the SAS specifically for that reason. So David Stirling was captured, and then in the aftermath of that, the concept was put together to expand into basically 2 regiments. So Paddy Mayne, in essence, commanding 1 SAS, or the rump of 1 SAS, in Italy, and then 2 SAS being formed under David Stirling, Bill Stirling's brother. And of course, Bill Stirling, not only had he played a key role in the formation of the commandos and special forces from the word go, but he also had been a guiding light to his brother David in the formation of the SAS, so he had that incredible pedigree. And Bill Stirling formed 2 SAS in North Africa. In Algeria, they had a training base near Philippeville, and Alcock was one of the earliest recruits to that unit. And in fact, Alcock became one of the key people that Bill Sterling would go around to all the bases in North Africa trying to get recruits for the SAS, and Alcock would accompany him. So he'd soldiered all the way through Italy with 2 SAS, and amongst many other extraordinary missions, he'd been involved in the raid on the Pistici concentration camp, where the SAS hijacked a train and drove it through enemy territory for 100 kilometres or so to a concentration camp and rescued all the concentration camp victims, and then brought the train back again. So Alcock had been on that mission. He'd actually been on the jeep-borne side of that mission, so they also sent a patrol of jeeps through to hold the main junction to enable the train to steam through. That's what Alcock had been involved on. So by the time Operation Pistol comes around, and we're now talking autumn 44, Alcock had a long and storied history in the SAS. And indeed, one of those individuals on his patrol for Operation Pistol was a Polish guy who they had recruited very early on during the fighting in Italy. Many of these individuals by now had been soldiering together in these small units for very extended periods of time. And Pistol, Operation Pistol as it was codenamed, was actually an adjunct to the much larger Operation Leuton, both autumn 44. And the raison d'etre of both missions was, if you can imagine, Allied forces pretty much have rolled up all of Nazi-occupied France, and they're sat almost on the border of Nazi Germany, waiting for the big push into Nazi Germany. And the last bastion of defence for the forces of Nazi Germany is one of the last bastions are the Vosges Mountains, which are not particularly high, but are pretty rugged and densely forested, and certainly inclement in winter, rain and snow, dense rain and snow. But also the western wall of the Vosges had been massively reinforced by the Germans. So, and this is where Hitler had vowed that his troops would make their last stand and ensure that Allied forces didn't march into the fatherland. And indeed, American and Canadian and British forces were massed up against that bulwark, against the western wall of the Vosges, unsure of how to break through. And so, in the summer of 44, the idea was put together that a party of two SAS would parachute into the Vosges Mountains and basically create mayhem and havoc behind enemy lines, deliberately targeting, where possible, senior officers, because that was the best way to make the enemy believe that no one was safe in the ranks. It was great for destroying morale, and to give the impression, by using their jeeps to travel far and wide across the Vosges, that there was a serious Allied breakthrough, in the hope that that would lead to the collapse of the front and enable the Allied breakthrough. So Pistol was an adjunct to Operation Leuton. It was just another of these parties that were dropped deep behind the lines, so 100 kilometres behind the lines, into the Vosges to carry out those missions. And in fact, Pistol, when they deployed, they were supposedly the most forward Allied troops, so they were the nearest to Nazi Germany itself. They dropped pretty much on the border of Nazi Germany.
And then that drop, how does that go? Because if you're going so far, becoming the furthest forward Allied forces, it's an incredibly dangerous situation to go into.
It is indeed, and the drop isn't particularly successful. You could argue. I mean, it's terrible weather, and as often happened in these kind of situations, the party gets split up in the process of dropping. Some of their containers carrying their weapons and explosives are lost in the terrible conditions, and some of those individuals who are on the mission are injured. And so very quickly, Alcock finds himself kind of splitting off from some of the main force to form his own kind of raiding unit, for want of a better word. With that determination, I mean, he was a sergeant at the time, that no matter your rank, so this egalitarian spirit of the SAS, no matter your rank and no matter who might have been lost along the way, you would prosecute the mission regardless and, carry it through to its bitter end. So in that spirit, Alcock and a handful of men set off to try to wreak havoc and mayhem amongst enemy forces. But the conditions are appalling. It's absolutely teeming with rain, cold. They don't have the right conditions. They've got no shelter, obviously. They're hugely exposed, and the train is crawling with enemy forces, because this is the direct kind of supply lines that they're now dropped into for the front of German forces in the Vosges.
And something that I found really interesting in the chapter was you were talking about some of the warnings that they'd had beforehand about working with the locals. And previously, when we've spoken about SAS, they seem to have quite a good relationship with the locals. But what was this kind of warning, and why was it given?
Yeah, so classically speaking, for guerrilla operations to be possible, and these are essentially guerrilla operations, you need one of two things. You either need wide open spaces where nobody lives, so like the deserts of North Africa were perfect because obviously you could drive through the desert if you could navigate and survive it, attack the enemy, disappear into the desert again, and return to your redoubt, whether that be in the Great Sand Sea or somewhere else where the enemy couldn't find you and couldn't even navigate their way there. So that's a perfect place to carry out guerrilla operations wilderness where nobody lives. If you don't have that, then you need the sympathy and the support of the locals, because you need them to shelter you, to succour you, to hide you from the enemy, and to keep secret your presence, and ideally to fight alongside you where possible. And of course, the SAS had that in France, in Spadefalls, because of the French resistance and the French population, who were largely, appalled at 4 or 5 years of occupation by the Nazis and wanted rid of them and would do anything to do so. And they had it to a certain extent in Italy, even, where you had real engagement from the partisans, the Italian partisans, which we tend to forget. And also, an awful lot of the Italians couldn't wait to get rid of Mussolini and his black shirts, his fascist black shirts. So you had it in all those situations, certainly to an extent that you could operate. In the Vosges, it's arguably very different. So on the Western Wall, where the German defences were, it was largely French speaking, and kind of, they very much saw themselves as French. On the Eastern Wall, so, on the approach to Nazi Germany itself, it became increasingly German speaking, and many of those locals viewed themselves largely as, German nationals. I mean, of course, the Vosges were part of France before the war, but that didn't alter the fact that many of the locals on the ground in that area were believed to have allegiances with Nazi Germany, certainly. And so, yeah, Alcock and his men, as were many of those who deployed on Operation Loiter, which was a far larger operation. There were at least 80 parachutists dropped in on Loiter, whereas it was around a dozen with Alcock's patrol. But they had been warned that the locals were not to be trusted. So that makes your mission, triply difficult, because without local intelligence, it's very hard to know where the enemy are, where their checkpoints are, where their strong points are, how they patrol, and most importantly, where you might be able to sabotage their supply routes, supply lines.
So how does Zolkok and his men take that into account as they're moving through with, injured comrades as well who have got injured or broken ankles and bones on the
Yeah, basically they attempt to pretty much follow orders. So, for the first 2 or 3 days they are hiding out, and as I say, it's just the heavens have opened and it's raining non-stop, and it's heavily populated by the enemy, so they're trying to hide wherever they can, and it's very, very difficult. Eventually they end up in the middle of this orchard in the middle of farmland. It's a very small orchard, and they get seen by a young child, and eventually 2 French farmers turn up, 2 local farmers, and the farmers basically convince them that they are not as headquarters has warned them, and they are as keen as anyone to see the forces of Nazi Germany thrown out of that area. I mean, one of the main reasons was because, locals in that area, young men certainly, had been rounded up en masse and forced to go and join the obligatory work day details, Todd organisation work details. So basically, slave labour, for want of a better word, for Nazi Germany, building defences and working in arms manufacturing plants and all the rest of it. So they were extremely upset at the way that their local menfolk have been treated. And so, when Alcock and his men turn up and they're found, and these French farmers approach them, they pretty quickly decide that it's safe to make common cause, and that the warnings from the UK, from headquarters, are certainly not true in this case, at least.
So, with the raison d'etre being to cause disruption behind enemy lines and to demoralise the Germans, because, as you mentioned at this point, they're being pushed back and the tide is starting to turn, how were they able to make the best out of this situation? Because, that he's having to form a group just to go out and disrupt people. He's got wide open terrain. they're missing supplies. How does Alcock adapt to that situation?
Well, using that age-old SAS adage to find a way or make one. I mean, that's really how he does it. You're absolutely right. Conditions are terrible. They've got, far less explosives and weaponry than they should have had because their containers have been scattered to the four corners of the wind. There's far less men than there should have been, and some of those are injured. But even so, he presses on with the mission. It's classic SAS stuff. The rule of thumb was basically even if every man on your patrol had been killed apart from you and you were a private, you would still go ahead and attempt to prosecute the mission because you had the ability to do so. And let's not forget, that's why those men who joined the SAS loved being in that unit. And that's why the only discipline that was ever required was self-discipline, because no one, having been in regular units where you were never told the reason behind what you were doing, you weren't empowered, you didn't feel part of something that was empowering and gave you a sense of a mission, or often you did not. So when they came into the SAS and they were empowered and their ideas were listened to, and regardless of their rank, they had the ability to throw in concepts about how to prosecute a mission, etc., etc. It gave these men an incredible sense of belonging and empowerment, and that meant that the last thing any of them ever wanted was to be thrown out of the unit for a misdemeanor. And so discipline was rigid, but it was self-discipline. In this situation, without that rigid self-discipline, the patrol would have fallen apart because they were soaked to the skin for days on end. There was nowhere to hide, surrounded by the enemy, very little intelligence, and only a few of the tools to do the job that they'd expected. But nevertheless, as a result, these French farmers talking to them, they realise that there is a railroad nearby which is used regularly by supply trains, German supply trains, which is exactly what they're there to blow up. And so they use the cover of darkness to approach that railroad, and they set what charges they have. They have enough to effectively blow up at least one train. And then they retire into the woods, in the pitch darkness and the rain, to wait to see the results of their handiwork. And sure enough, a train, steams through and gets blown to pieces. Charges erupt, and there are wounded Germans from the train kind of stumbling through the undergrowth. And at that stage, Alcock signals the moment has come to start what becomes their great escape, because they now only have one way to get back to friendly forces. I mean, the original concept of Operation Leuchten and Pistol was that Allied forces would break through very quickly, and so they would basically be overrun by Allied forces and they would not need to escape and evade, if that makes sense. They would basically just hide and wait for the Allies to come to them. Never happened in either case. I mean, in Operation Leuchten, you had 80 men behind enemy lines, and the Allies were never going to get there in time to relieve them. Because basically what happened was, bullets, explosives, food ran out, and cold weather gear completely lacking. There was no way they were going to survive more than kind of late October. Alcock, realising this, basically says we have to make our way on foot through this incredible concentration of the enemy to the enemy's front line, and then somehow cross the enemy's front line, and then somehow cross into our own front lines without getting killed, and that's the only way home.
Reading that Great Escape, my heart was racing because out of all the ones that I've read, I think it was perhaps one of the most terrifying ones. But then, even this, and I do want to pull on this string a little bit more, even in that attack and that derailing of the train, there seems to be this concern about how effective that attack would be, owing to the nature of their explosives, owing to the experience that the Germans actually have with dealing with the SAS now, because they've been working behind enemy lines for years at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So, not only do they not have as much explosives as they hope to have, because containers have been scattered, but also everything's soaked. And the very earliest missions of the SAS, the very earliest operation of the SAS, Operation Squatter, of course, was a complete disaster in part because they parachuted into a desert storm and everything got soaked. And the timer pencils and the fuses just didn't work because they hadn't manufactured them to be, completely waterproof. Well, by now, of course, they've improved the kit, but it doesn't mean that explosives and timer pencils and fuses and cordite, react very well to an extended soaking over many days. So that's the first problem. Second problem is, by now they're aware of the fact that the Germans know that, patrols of British and Allied forces are dropping deep behind lines, in particular to blow up trains. And so a lot of the trains have these kind of sweepers, they're called. So they're basically attached to the front of the train, and they sweep the line ahead of the train to remove any explosives. And so, they don't know whether A, the explosives will actually work, or B, whether the Germans will have one of those kind of devices fitted to the train. So it's a very tense moment in that woodland, waiting to see if they struck home. And bear in mind, if the sabotage attack wasn't successful, then, not only have they risked all they've risked to date for nothing, but also the escape and evasion that follows, which they know is going to be epic, and probably, on balance, is going to end in failure, in their capture or their death. All of that will arguably have been in vain, because they failed in their mission.
It's such an extraordinary moment of luck that train doesn't have one of those sweepers. But you say, then they have to get away. But they're in, German territory, which means increased troops, Secret Service, their Gestapo, SS, which is, incredibly knowledgeable about that local area and the people in it. How does that play a role in how they try and escape?
Well, they are, they're on the run for several days, but, reasonably quickly they end up in a situation where by rights they should have been captured. I mean, it's almost beyond belief how they managed to get out of it. So basically they're moving through terrain where obviously there are German troops, there's Gestapo and SS, but there's also, locals, French locals, and there are nationals of other nations captured by the enemy, being forced to labour with the Todd organisation and slave labour. So there's Poles and Czechs and other nationals. So they're encountering these various forces on the way, hiding from them, getting intelligence from them when they can, and eventually they come across a couple of Polish woodsmen. And because they're Polish, and of course the Poles were such staunch allies of Great Britain and the Allies in the war, and because their own country had been occupied and terribly oppressed, they presume they are bona fide comrades and on side. And so these two Polish workers say, look, conditions are terrible. They're soaking wet the whole time. So the chance to dry out is an absolute must. And the two Polish workers say, there's a house up ahead, go there. Farmhouse, remote farmhouse. There's two Polish ladies in the farmhouse, they'll look after you. And so they do. They trust them, they go there. And so they turn up, and lo and behold, there are two Polish women there, young women who are very, very welcoming, and take them in, and, they're drying all their clothes out and having some hot food and whatever it might be, which is an absolute lifesaver on an extended escape and evasion like this, where you are soaked through and freezing cold for days on end with no proper equipment, or very little proper equipment. And then, they've been there a couple of hours or so, and suddenly they hear the approach of a truck, and it's a truck full of German troops. And they realise they've been betrayed. And it can only be those two Polish woodsmen who betrayed them. And it's like consternation, because what on earth are two Polish woodsmen doing acting as traitors? It doesn't add up. But even so, they're now pretty much trapped. And so they realise that the enemy have sent, some of their troops around the back of the house, and some are coming to the front door. So they ask the two Polish girls to go to the front door and buy them a bit of time. And they muster themselves at the back door ready to break out. And then Alcock remembers they've left some of their equipment on the kitchen table. And there's two reasons why that's a disaster. The first reason is it's crucial kit, it's magazines full of ammo, that kind of stuff. But secondly, it's evidence to prove to the enemy that they were there, and that means it's a death sentence for those two Polish ladies. Alcock goes back into the room, and there are several German troops who've come in already, and it's testimony to their incredible training with response times in terms of how quickly you can draw and fire and use your weapons, that Alcock and his men basically kill all of those German troops in that room, retrieve their equipment, and finally, as Alcock is leaving, a red-headed German soldier comes down the stairs. He's been searching upstairs, and they kind of lock eyes for a moment, and Alcock decides to let him live in this kind of really poignant moment of clemency, I guess. And then they bomb burst out the back of the house, and they jump over the back wall, and they're running down into the forest, and they're now being chased by rifle fire and machine gun fire, but they get into the woods unscathed somehow. Then they're tearing through the woods, changing cuisine as they go, and they reach a open track. And Alcock knows, again, it's because of experience and training, he knows that if they just keep running, they're probably going to end up getting shot or captured because the enemy are after them, and the enemy will be fresher than they are. So they set an ambush on the track. They stop and set an ambush. And the enemy, lo and behold, come running forward, and they take them on and kill several more. And eventually they manage to extricate themselves from that ambush. So now they're in a situation where some of the locals are trustworthy, some of the locals aren't trustworthy, and there's everything in between. And to make it even worse, actually, what then happens is they hear two distant gunshots which come from the direction of the farmhouse, and they can only presume that the enemy have executed the two young Polish girls who were helping them.
And it's incredible and extraordinary that even in that moment where there's possible freedom, Alcock is still thinking about the possible repercussions for those two.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that really, makes this story stand out, is that, he and his patrol were, although of course they were determined to escape and evade, but at the same time they did everything in their power not to have the terrible repression and reprisals of the German military, but more importantly the Gestapo and SS, visited on those who helped them. So several times they're taken in by French farmers, these incredibly brave French farmers who time and again shelter them, and actually shelter them during searches by the Gestapo of the properties, for example. Several times that happens. And in each of those situations, the French farmers are insistent they stay and shelter and keep warm and get fed, and Alcock is always determined to move on before the locals, will end up paying the price.
So how did the Germans respond? Because obviously you've got this small force going through, they've killed several members of the army, of the Gestapo. Obviously, that kind of anger and reaction is going to be more visceral.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hunter forces are sent in, as you can imagine. This is arguably one of the reasons they're there. It was incumbent upon any member of the British military who was captured to try and escape at the earliest opportunity, and never to try to stop escaping, if for no other reason than if you escaped, it would tie down hundreds, maybe thousands of enemy troops trying to recapture you. That's one of the reasons why you were obliged to escape. And in this situation, they're basically involved in a massive escape and evasion across the Vosges Mountains. And they are tying up hundreds, maybe thousands of German troops trying to search for them. And there are lots of close encounters. And it's testament to their training and their endurance that they manage to avoid most of them, because they are always at a disadvantage. They've got no shelter, they've got very little food, they've been on the run for days on end, the conditions are appalling. So by rights they should have been the ones to get captured and not been able to avoid the enemy, but somehow they do.
You make a really, really interesting point there at the end. It's a testament to their endurance, but how do they deal with the fatigue that comes along with this? This is, as we've said before, it's open ground. It's horrible. Like it's wet. It's cold. They're going through the Vosges Mountains. How do they deal with that physically and mentally?
Yeah, obviously, if you've ever trekked, at length through appalling conditions, and I have done some of that, quite a lot of it actually, as a war reporter, and at high altitude as well. It is incredibly destroying, both to you physically, but also to your soul, to your psychology. I can remember a moment when I was actually trekking Mont Blanc and reached a high pass, and we, hadn't had enough to eat, freezing cold, and I just hit the wall, and I literally would not have been able to go on. The only reason I didn't actually end up, probably freezing to death on the mountain was because my buddy stopped and fed me an energy bar, and that got me going again. So in this situation, they are up against all of that and more, far more. And one of the things that the SAS had perfected by now was the use of benzodrine, which is a euphoric stimulant, pretty much like speed, which basically had been invented because what happened was the Germans at the start of the war were fueling their troops on, gosh, what's the name of the drug? Golly, just a minute, it'll come to me. Pervitin. So before the war, the Germans had invented this drug called Pervitin, same kind of euphoric stimulant. And during, the first opening months of the war, all of that blitzkrieg that we saw, all of these troops operating lightning fast warfare for days on end, well, a lot of it was fueled by the use of pervitin. And then their air crews were using it for their flights, their bombing runs to Britain during the Blitz. And one crew was shot down, an aircraft was shot down, and we captured some of this pervitin. And so it was analysed and realised what it was. And Churchill said, I need some of that for our troops. And so that's how we invented Benzedrine. So by now, the SAS have perfected the use of Benzedrine to fuel you in extremis. But the problem with Benzedrine is you can only use it for a certain period of time. It will boost you for, maybe 48 hours, maybe 72 hours at the outside. But after that, you will seriously hit the wall, because it's a heightened stage of kind of speed driven endurance, but once you hit the wall from that kind of drug high, it's incredibly debilitating. So I can only presume that they were using Benzedrine, like all units by now were equipped with it. It was part of your escape and evasion kit. I've actually got somewhere a tin which is a Benzedrine tin from an SS escape kit. It only keeps you going for so long. And so what Alcock and his men ended up doing was, it was like a relay. If you can imagine a relay from, when they're about to hit that wall, they threw themselves on the mercy and the hospitality of the local French farmers. And the rule of thumb was you chose the remotest farmstead, because the poorest, most rural inhabitants tended to always be the greater supporters of the resistance and the Allies. And so in that way, kind of like doing a relay between safe house to safe house, they managed to, pull on through.
And in any kind of endurance or sport, that wall is so difficult to get through and push through. And thank you for sharing your personal story on that as well, because that's a real insight. But then obviously, these men are behind enemy lines, and they need to cross through the enemy line to get to a safe haven. So how do they cross through a German line that is tired, angry, and starting to lose morale in need of a victory against some Allied forces?
Yeah, so obviously that moment of trying to cross the German lines is the most dangerous moment of all. This is the most heavily defended part of Western Europe at that moment. And, it's a truism that earlier on in the war, you could argue there was a kind of more, gentleman isn't quite the right word, but there was a certain honour to the way that the German military behaved in combat. I mean, North Africa was famously called a war without hate. And there was some truth to that. But by now, and that's because they were not on the back foot. They didn't have their backs to the wall. But by now, of course, they literally have their backs to the wall. This is the final redoubt before the Allies march into Nazi Germany. Hitler has, told them time and time again, that must not happen. Nazi Germany must not fall. And of course, they have the Russians advancing from the east at the same time. So you can imagine the trigger-happy and desperate nature of those defensive positions, and they have been very effective. American armour is massed up against the Vosges Mountains Western Wall, but it's not broken through. Now, of course, they had problems with keeping the Shermans and other armoured vehicles supplied with fuel. That's true, but even so, they have not managed to break through the Western Wall of the Vosges yet. Alcock and his few men are trying to break through the other way to get through the Western Wall from the eastern side, so from the side least expected by the enemy. So that approach is, it's one made at night. Again, they choose a night where the weather is appalling, hoping that will keep the enemy's heads down, and they just have to try to belly crawl and sneak their way through those enemy positions, moving as slowly as necessary to make sure they get through undetected.
And then once they got through, this is the bit that, despite the darkness of this escape, despite the brutality of the Germans, it's after they got through the German line that strikes me the most as just something that must have felt like a massive insult to these men. How do the Americans and the Allied line react and treat them as they're coming towards them?
Yeah, so obviously, they don't know what part of the Allied line they're going to hit. And there are, American, British, Canadian, and French and other nationals making up the Allied positions along that front line. So they don't know which troops they're going to approach. And what happens is, as they realise they've left the German lines behind, and as they cross no man's land, and then near the Allied positions, they see a machine gun nest on top of a small hill and realise that the machine gunner is lining them up as if to gun them down. Well, in a sense, you can't blame him, because he sees a bunch of guys sneaking towards them from the direction of the German lines. What's he to think? He's going to think they're German troops. There's every reason for him to believe that way. And by now, their uniforms are so sodden and mud encrusted and blood encrusted and falling apart that they're pretty much unidentifiable. So Alcock stops his men and says, if we continue, as we've been moving, we're going to come under fire from our own side. And so he then orders his men to split up, and half of them will kind of act like a decoy force, and the other force will actually go and storm the Allied machine gun nest to seize it, to stop them getting fired upon by their own side. And that's exactly what they proceed to do. And it turns out that it's American forces manning that machine gun nest, and they take it. And then, of course, once they've taken the machine gun nest, they're able to explain who they are without being shot by their own side. And of course, it takes some convincing, but they share a common language. And eventually, once they've talked their way through, Alcock is then taken to meet one of the senior Allied commanders, because, of course, the other thing he and his men have been doing all the way through that epic escape and evasion, they have been making notes on the positions and the makeup of the German forces all along that route, so that they can hand them over to the Allies, so they can be hit by airstrikes. And that's exactly what they proceed to do. They hand over this dossier of intelligence, and the airstrikes go in that very morning to take out all those key positions that they'd spied out.
And it is just a story of such extraordinary bravery, but also, management. You're not only managing yourself, your fatigue, your men, but also the several tasks at hand. So how is Alcock and his men treated afterwards?
Well, not particularly well. But look, every escaper was treated like the enemy. Every escaper is treated like the enemy, and there's a reason for it. It doesn't go down well with the escapees, but the reason for it is very, very straightforward. Let's imagine you were in the SAS, and let's imagine you'd escaped from, a year in captivity behind, in some series of prisoner of war camps. You get back to your lines. What's to mean that you're not an Allied spy? What's to mean you've not been turned? What's to argue that you've not been allowed to escape for that very reason? So every single escaper who gets back to Allied lines is treated like the enemy and interrogated. They call them escape reports, but they're not. They're basically interrogations, often by MI5 officers, to work out, to establish their bona fides. And it's only once you've been able to establish your bona fides and actually say, convince those interrogating you that you are exactly who you say you are, and you've not been turned by the enemy, that you are welcomed as you hoped you might be. And in some situations, absolute bona fide, a brilliant escapees never managed to do that. There's another escapee I wrote about in the book, the French escapee. Well, his colleague Sibard, who does the most incredible escape across Allied occupied Europe. In fact, his escape is so incredible, the British won't believe him. His British interrogators refuse to believe him, and they lock him up from the moment he gets back to the UK until the end of the war, pretty much. Yeah, it's not ideal, but that's the way that we deemed that it had to be done. And every professional armed forces in the war behaved in the same way. Some behaved worse, actually, in terms of the degree of interrogation their troops were submitted to after breaking out. So, what happens to Alcock and his men is pretty much par for the course. It doesn't make it any less easier to kind of read about or get your head around, but that's pretty much, what happened.
And it's hard to believe that they get that kind of treatment, even though they did, just because of how difficult these escapes are and how much they're putting on the line whilst they're going through these enemy territories. But I think this is the right moment, Damien, to ask a final fun question, as we always do. A lot of these stories and a lot of escapes that you write about can be quite dark. Especially, I remember Daggers Drawn being especially dark. But what is, your favourite bright moment within the war stories that you have read in people's diaries and people's correspondence, or you've seen across your work?
The favourite bright moment, I guess in this volume, SAS Great Escapes Four, there's that incredible moment in Gibson's escape story where, so Gibson was in the Long Range Desert Group, the forerunner to the SAS, and then he was in the SAS as David Stirling's driver. And then after that, he's deployed to Yugoslavia, which is a theatre I've very rarely written about, and I haven't read much about Yugoslavia. It's not really covered that much. Real pleasure to write about it. Gibson's there, and he's sent in with his patrol to link up with the Yugoslav partisans, and the Yugoslav partisans don't trust them initially, don't necessarily want them there, and there's this kind of rule that is imposed upon them. You're not here to fight. You're here as advisors at the very best. And then the Yugoslav partisan unit that Gibson's men are with gets surrounded by a bunch of the enemy, and they're heavily outnumbered. And eventually the Yugoslav commander realises that unless he allows the SAS to join in the fight, they're done for. And so they join in the fight, and not only do they join in the fight, they do such a sterling job that at the end of it, the Yugoslav commander goes, "Well, all right then, I guess you're here for the duration." That kind of bonding that goes on between them from that moment onward, with their Yugoslav partisan comrades, is really, really spectacular and wonderful to read about. So yeah, there are always bright moments among the darkness.
Thank you for that. I have particularly enjoyed chapter 4 and the Yugoslav stories. Now, if people want to read more about that Yugoslav story and the other stories you got in this book, where can people get a copy of SAS Great Escapes 4?
Yeah, so it will be in all good bookshops, available on Amazon and in all the main supermarkets actually as well. So just watch out for it and grab a copy off the shelves. It's the kind of uplifting stories we really need in these insecure and difficult times that we're living through.
No, I totally agree. And then where can people go away and interact with you and your work online?
Yeah, so my website is just my name, damienlewis.com. I'm on Twitter at authordlewis, and I'm on Facebook at Damien Lewis Writer. So just follow me on those, and I'm pretty active, so always something going on.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for coming on again, Damien. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Appreciate it, as always.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast.